Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together once again to join in the study and the living out of matters of Torah. It's wonderful that we can share ourselves and this wonderful text with one another. We are in Parshat Korach, which you can find in the book of Numbers, chapter 16. It begins at the very first verse of chapter 16. What we'll do is we will share reading the English translation. Then I'll provide you with a little bit of focus study, and then we'll open it up so that everyone can have an opportunity to share your own reflections and responses to this week's Torah portion. But with that, let us say our blessing for this wonderful opportunity to immerse ourselves in words, deeds, and relationships of Torah. So if you'd like to go ahead and unmute, then we can say our blessing together. We say our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai
Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Thank you, God, for this wonderful opportunity to share one another and to share one another in the context of this wonderful, rich tradition we call Torah. So we are in chapter 16 of the book of Numbers, verse 1. Let me share with you the opening verses, and then I'll invite others to have an opportunity to read as well. Now Korach, son of Ishar, son of Kohath, son of Levi, betook himself along with Datan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, and On, son of Pelech, descendants of Reuben, to rise up against Moses, together with 250 Israelites, chieftains of the community, chosen in the assembly, men of repute. They combined against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You've gone too far, for all the community are holy, all of them, and God is in their midst. Why then do you raise yourselves above God's congregation?" We're now on verse 4 of chapter 16. Anna, would you like to read a little bit?
When Moses heard this, he fell on his face. Then he spoke to Korach and all his company, saying, "Come morning, Adonai will make known who is God and who is holy, and will grant him direct access. The one whom God has chosen will be granted access. Do this, you, Korach, and all your band, take fire pans, and tomorrow put fire in them and lay incense on them before Adonai. Then the candidate whom Adonai chooses, he shall be the Holy One. You have gone too far, sons of Levi."
So now we're at verse 8. Steve or Sherry, would you like to read a little bit? Okay.
Moses said further to Korah, "Hear me, sons of Levi. Is it not enough for you that the God of Israel has set you apart from the community of Israel and given you access to him to perform the duties of the Lord's tabernacle and to minister to the community and serve them? Now that he has advanced you and all your fellow Levites with you, do you seek the priesthood too? Truly, it is against the Lord that you and all your company have banded together. For who is Aaron that you should rail against him?"
Thank you, Steve. And Richard, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 12?
Yes, thank you. Moses sent for Dathan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, but they said, "We will not come. Is it not enough that you brought us from a land flowing with milk and honey and have us die in the wilderness, that you would also lord it over us? Even if you had brought us to a land with milk and honey and given us possessions of fields and vineyards, should you gouge out those men's eyes? We will not come." Moses was much aggrieved, and he said to the Lord, "Pay no regard to their presentation. I have not taken the ass of any one of them, nor have I wronged any one of them."
Thank you, Richard. Daniel, would you like to read a little bit, starting at verse 16?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Moses said to Korah, "Tomorrow You and all your company appear before the Eternal, you and they and Aaron. Each of you take his fire pan and lay incense on it, and each of you bring his fire pan before the Eternal, 250 fire pans. You and Aaron also bring your fire pans. Each of them took his fire pans, put fire in it, laid incense on it, and took his place at the entrance of the tent of the meeting, as did Moses and Aaron. Korah gathered the whole community against him at the entrance of the tent of the meeting.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I'm going to invite some other people to read now. And so, June, would you like to read a little bit, beginning there at verse, at the middle of verse 19?
Are we not? And the Lord, thank you, Rabbi. And the Lord spoke unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. And they fell upon their faces and said, O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and wilt thou be wroth with all the congregation? And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, speak unto the congregation, saying, get you up from about the dwelling of Korah, Datan, and Abiram. And Moses rode up and went unto Datan and Abiram, and the elders of Israel followed him. And he spoke unto the congregation, saying, depart, I pray you, from the tents of these wicked men, and touch nothing of theirs, lest ye be swept away in all their sins. Shall I continue?
One last verse there, 27.
So they got them up from the dwelling of Korah, Datan and Abiram on every side, and Datan and Abiram came out and stood at the door of their tents with their wives and their sons and their little ones.
Thank you so much. Margot, would you like to read a little bit?
Rabbi, I'm lost.
Okay,
So,
we're
no,
at verse.
somebody else. I know where we are, but my book doesn't read the same way.
It's all right.
Well, on someone else.
Okay,
So I
Gary,
find
we're
myself-
at verse 28. Would you like to read a little bit at verse 28?
Thank you, yes.
Thank you, Gary.
And Moses said, by this you shall know that it was the Eternal who sent me to do all these things, that they are not of my own devising. If these people's death is not that of all humankind, if their lot is humankind's common fate, it was not the Eternal who sent me. But if the Eternal brings about something unheard of, so that the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they shall go down alive into Sheol, you shall know that these fellows have spurned the Eternal. Scarcely had he finished speaking all these words when the ground under them burst asunder, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households, all Korah's people and all their possessions. They went down alive into Sheol with all that belonged to them. The earth closed over them, and they vanished from their midst of the congregation. All Israel around them fled out at their shrieks, for they said, the earth might swallow us.
Go ahead, and one more verse.
And a fire went forth from the Eternal and consumed the 250 representatives offering the incense.
Thank you, Gary. Robin, would you like to read at the very start of chapter 17?
Yes, thank you. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, order Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, to remove the fire pans, for they have become sacred, from among the charred remains, and scatter the coals abroad. Remove the fire pans of those who have sinned at the cost of their lives, and let them be made into hammered sheets as plating for the altar. For once they have been used for offering to Adonai, they have become sacred. And let them serve as a warning to the people of Israel. Eleazar the priest took the copper fire pans, which had been used for offering by those who died in the fire, and they were hammered into plating for the altar, as Adonai had ordered him through Moses. It was to be a reminder to the Israelites, so that no outsider, one not of Aaron's offspring, should presume to offer incense before Adonai and suffer the fate of Korah and his band.
Thank you, Robin. Paul, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 6?
Yes, Rabbi. The entire assembly of the children of Israel complained on the morrow against Moses and Aaron, saying, you have killed the people of Hashem And it was when the assembly gathered against Moses and Aaron, they turned to the tent of the meeting, and behold, the cloud had covered it, and the glory of Hashem appeared. Moses and Aaron came before the tent of the meeting. Hashem spoke to Moses, saying, remove yourselves from among this assembly, and I shall destroy them in an instant. They fell on their faces. Moses said to Aaron, take the fire pan and put on it fire from upon the altar, and place the incense, and go quickly to the assembly and provide atonement for them. For the fury has gone out from the presence of Hashem. The plague has begun. Aaron took as Moses had spoken and ran to the midst of the congregation. And behold, the plague had begun among the people. He placed the incense and provided atonement for the people. He stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was checked. Those who died in the plague were 14,700, aside from those who died because of the affair of Korah. Aaron returned to Moses at the entrance of the tent of the assembly, and the plague had been checked.
Thank you, Paul. Steve, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 16?
The Lord spoke to Moses.
Oh, I have another Steve here.
There's
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
It's
Yeah.
okay.
Steve Brenton, yes.
Okay, thank you. The Eternal One spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelite people and take from them, from the chieftains of their ancestral houses, one staff for each chieftain of an ancestral house, 12 staffs in all. Inscribe each one's name on his staff, there being one staff for each head of an ancestral house.
I mean, so far it's,
Also inscribe Aaron's name on the staff of Levi.
maybe that's.
Deposit them in
Yeah,
the tent.
just reading.
Deposit them in the tent of meeting before the pact, where I meet with you. The staff of the candidate whom I choose shall sprout, and I will rid myself of the incessant mutterings of Israelites against you.
Thank you, Steve. And now Jim and Peggy, would you like to pick up there at verse 21?
Thank you, Rabbi. Moses spoke thus to the Israelites. The chieftains gave him a staff for each chieftain of an ancestral house, 12 staffs in all. Among these staffs was that of Aaron. Moses deposited the staffs before Adonai in the tent of the pact. The next day, Moses entered the tent of the pact, and there the staff of Aaron of the house of Levi had sprouted. It had brought forth sprouts, produced blossoms, and borne almonds. Moses then brought out all the staffs from before Adonai to all the Israelites, each identified and recovered his staff. Adonai said to Moses, put Aaron's staff back before the pact to be kept as a lesson to rebels, that their muttering against me may cease, lest they die. This Moses did, just as Adonai had commanded him, so he did. But the Israelites said to Moses, lo, we perish. We are lost, all of us lost. Everyone who so much as ventures near Adonai's tabernacle must die. Alas, we are doomed to perish.
Thank you, Peggy.
Adonai said to Aaron, you and your sons and the ancestral house under your charge shall bear any guilt connected with the sanctuary. You and your sons alone shall bear any guilt connected with your priesthood. You shall also associate with yourself your kinsmen, the tribe of Levi, your ancestral tribe, to be attached to you, to minister to you, while you and your sons under your charge are before the tent of the pact. They shall discharge their duties to you and to the tent as a whole, but they must not have any contact with the furnishings of the shrine or with the altar, lest both they and you die. They shall be attached to you and discharge the duties of the tent of meeting, all the services of the tent, but no outsider shall intrude upon you as you discharge the duties connected with the shrine and the altar. That wrath may not again strike the Israelites.
Thank you, Jim. Let me invite David and Susan. Would you like to begin reading at verse 6?
We are honored, and it is our pleasure. Go, Susan.
God spoke further to Aaron. Wait a minute, are we at 6?
Yeah.
I hereby take your fellow Levites from among the Israelites. They are assigned to you in dedication to God, to do the work of the tent of meeting, while you and your sons shall be careful to perform your priestly duties in everything pertaining to the altar and to what is behind the curtain. I make your priesthood a service of dedication. Any outsider who encroaches shall be put to death.
And Hashem said to Aaron, and I have given charge of my donations to you for all the holy things of the children of Israel. I've given them to you as an anointing, and to your sons as an eternal law. This shall be yours from the Holy of Holies, from the fire. Every offering of theirs, every grain offering of theirs, and every sin offering of theirs, and every guilt offering of theirs, that they will pay back to me. It is Holy of Holies for you and for your sons. You shall eat of it in the Holy of Holies. Every male shall eat it, and it shall be holy to you. And this is yours, your gift donation, all the elevation offerings of the children of Israel. I have given them to you and to your sons and to your daughters with you as an eternal law. Everyone who is pure in your house shall eat it.
Thank you so much, David and Susan. Mark Levinstein, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 12? Okay.
Sorry, I'm not, I don't have the book in front of me right now.
Okay, that's
Sorry.
fine, Mark. Thank you. Nice to have you with us.
I
Let me
found
invite
that place again.
Cheryl, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 12? And you'll need to unmute, Cheryl.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Rabbi. All the best of the new oil, wine, and grain, the choice parts that they present to Adonai, I give to you, the first fruits of everything in their land, that they shall bring to Adonai shall be yours. Every one of your household who is pure may eat them. Everything that has been proscribed in Israel shall be yours. The first male issue of the womb of every being, human or beast, that is offered to Adonai shall be yours. But you shall have the male firstborn of human beings redeemed, and you shall also have the firstling of impure animals redeemed. Take as their redemption price from the age of 1 month on, the money equivalent to 5 shekels by the sanctuary weight, which is 20 gerahs. But the firstlings of cattle, sheep, or goats may not be redeemed. They are consecrated. You shall dash their blood against the altar and turn their fat into smoke as an offering by fire for a pleasing odor to Adonai. But their meat shall be yours. It shall be yours like the beast, like the breast of elevation offering, and like the right thigh.
Thank you, Cheryl. Mark Thompson, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 19?
Yes, thank you. All the sacred gifts that the Israelites set aside for Adonai, I give to you, to your sons, and to the daughters that are with you, as a due for all time. It shall be an everlasting covenant of salt before Adonai for you and for your offspring as well. And Adonai said to Aaron, you shall, however, have no territorial share among them or own any portion in their midst. I am your portion and your share among the Israelites. And to the Levites, I hereby give all the tithes in Israel as their share in return for the services that they perform, the services of the tent of meeting. Henceforth, Israelites shall not trespass on the tent of meeting and thus incur guilt and die. Only Levites shall perform the services of the tent of meeting. Others would incur guilt. It is the law for all time throughout the ages, but they shall have no territorial share among the Israelites. For it is the tithes set aside by the Israelites as a gift to Adonai that I give to the Levites as their share. Therefore, I have no say I have said concerning them, they shall have no territorial share among the Israelites.
Thank you, Mark. Jay Iser, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 25?
Thank you, Rabbi. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Levites and say to them, when you receive from the Israelites their tithes, which I have assigned to you as your share, you shall set aside from them 1/10 of the tithe as a gift to Adonai. This shall be accounted to you as your gift. As with the new grain from the threshing floor or the flow from the vat, so shall you on your part set aside a gift for Adonai from all the tithes that you receive from the Israelites. And from them you shall bring the gift to Adonai, to Aaron the priest. You shall set aside all gifts due to Adonai from everything that is donated to you, from each thing its best portion, the part thereof that is to be consecrated."
Thank you, Jay. And Margot, would you like to read
Yeah, I'm with us again.
verse 30?
I
Thank you.
had turned 2 pages. Okay, verse 30. Say to them further, when you have removed the best part from it, you Levites may consider it the same as the yield of the threshing floor or vat. You and your household services in the tent of meeting, for it is your recompense for your service to the tent of meeting. You will incur no guilt, though if through it, my glasses are not working now. You shall incur no guilt through it once you have removed the best part from it, but you must not profane the sacred donations of the Israelites, lest you die.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. That is our entire Torah portion for the week. I'd like to share with you just a little bit of focus study, and then we'll open it up for everyone's thoughts and comments and reflections on this week's Torah portion. So one of the most dramatic events in the journey of the Israelites occurs in our Torah portion this week, and that is this act of rebellion, this challenge that's raised by Korach and several hundred other people, challenging the authority of Moses and Aaron. And you may remember that just recently in our reading, we had a kind of challenge that was raised by Miriam and ostensibly also by Aaron to Moses, criticizing him, apparently, at least expressly, based upon his choice of a wife.
Yeah.
And now we have this more widespread and political challenge that's being raised by Korach. Just as Miriam and Aaron were related to Moses, they were his brother and sister, Korach is also related to Moses. Korach is a cousin of Moses. So it's very interesting to see how this initial set of challenges that's being raised comes from deep within Moses's intimate family, and it begins to spread throughout the whole community. So we're going to focus a little bit on the nature of this challenge that's being raised by Korach and those who align themselves with him. On your study sheet in number 1, I have a verse from this week's portion, chapter 16, verse 32. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their household, all of Korach's people. I find it fascinating, this image that we have here of the earth opening its mouth, its pecha, and swallowing them, because we're going to see that the challenge, of course, that's raised begins with this voicing of a strong opinion, of some rhetoric, of a challenge that's laid out in words to Moses. And so in response, the punishment is an opening up of another mouth. In this case, the mouth of the earth that swallows up those who raised this verbal challenge to the leadership of Moses. We're going to proceed to see how tradition and perhaps some contemporary commentary treats the nature of this challenge. So we have a number 2 on the study sheet from the Mishnah, from Avot, this classic statement: any controversy that is for the sake of heaven will result in abiding value. But any controversy that is not for the sake of heaven will not have abiding value. Which controversy was for the sake of heaven? The controversy between Hillel and Shammai. And which controversy was not for the sake of heaven? The controversy of Korach and his company. There's a lot of commentary that begins to define further, well, what was it about the relationship of Hillel and Shammai and the kind of disagreements that they had that made their arguments and their disagreements for the sake of heaven, whereas the kind of argument and disagreement that Korach and his followers are raising were not for the sake of heaven. We're going to look a little bit deeper into the very nature within rabbinic tradition about this whole term that we have for argumentation, which appears in the Talmud. So in number 3, I have the term that's used in Talmud to describe an argument, and that's machloket. Machloket comes from the Hebrew verb chalak, which interestingly enough means both to divide and to share. So in English grammar, we have a term called a contronym. A contronym is a word that means it's opposites. So one of the classic instances of a contronym is cleave, because cleave means both to cut apart, to separate, and also means to adhere. So it has 2 definitions that seemingly are opposite one another. So here we seem to have, in the Hebrew word chalak, what could be called in English grammar a contronym. So in many cultures, the word division carries with it a nuance of separation, of holding on to one's own, of retreating into opposing camps and so forth. But what if this word machloket is not what we would call in English grammar a contronym? What if it's a word that means exactly what it says which is that to divide is to share? That we're going to explore a little bit in some of our further commentary here about how in Talmud the word machloket, when it's connoting something being a difference of opinion, we'll find is actually a sharing rather than a separating into warring camps. So here is in number 4, there's a bit of commentary from the great Hasidic rabbi, Rabbi Nachman, who writes this: know that dispute is an aspect of the creation of the world. For had all the Torah scholars been in argument, there would have been, in agreements rather, there would have been no room for the creation of the world. It was only by way of the dispute between them that there was formed between them an aspect of the empty space. What Rabbi Nachman here is doing, he's building upon the notion of what creation is described as in Kabbalah, which is in Kabbalah describes the creation as at some time, all there was the unity that we give the name, the source of all life to, we give the name God to. And then at some point, according to Kabbalah, God withdraws from a portion of that total unity, creating a space into which other forms of beings and existence can come into creation. So that notion of separating is what gives all of what we see around us, brings all of it into existence. So that's why Rabbi Nachman is alluding to this notion that dispute, separation is an aspect of creation of the world. And he's here now applying that to the notion of argumentation between sages, that if everyone was in agreement, then there would be no new things that would grow and exist. There would just be this total unity. It's only because there's an argument between sages that new ideas, new perspectives can come into existence. Okay? So there's a holiness, a generative aspect to argument when it's done properly. We're going to pursue that a little bit further. If you have a study sheet, you can turn it over, and we're going to get to a little bit more contemporary commentaries about this whole notion of machloket. First is a quote from a rabbi, a French rabbi, Marc-Alain Wachtin, who wrote a fantastic book that's largely about the Talmud called The Burnt Book. And he wrote this: in the word machloket, we can read, and he has here the consonants, if you will, machlak, tav, which means that the duality, difference of opinion, refuses to give the word death the chance to constitute itself. So what he's saying here, we have the word machloket. In the middle of the word machloket is our verb chalak, which is the notion of dividing, sharing, argumentation, and it's separated on either side by these two consonants, which in English we'll call M and T. If you just put M and T together in Hebrew, you would have the Hebrew word met, which means death. So Rabbi Marc-Alain Wachtin is saying argumentation keeps death from happening. So there is this procreative aspect, this life-giving aspect to argumentation when, again, it's handled appropriately. So we're going to continue this notion about the potential for opposition to be an engendering, life-giving force rather than a destructive force. And here's what Aviva Zornberg writes in her book, Bewilderment. God can reveal himself to human beings only because of this human ability to allow the shock of otherness in the encounter with another human being. The face of the other creates a traumatic upheaval in experience, which ruptures the complacencies of one's own prejudices. This is the vital rupture that makes it possible to experience revelation or inspiration. Aviva Zornberg is taking this even deeper, and she's now describing how our encounters with someone who's different than us creates a kind of challenge to our own preconceptions. And it's that very challenge to our own preconceptions that makes it possible to learn something new, to collaborate with another person in coming up with something new. In number 7 is a bit of commentary by an Israeli rabbi, Rav Itamar Eldar, who wrote an article called Controversy for the Sake of Heaven. And he writes this, begins by quoting from the Talmud, from Kiddushin. In a war between two Torah sages, they did not move from there until they became lovers. So Rabbi Eldar writes this: the love the sages promise is not the resolution of the dispute, but rather the ability to contain both sides of the uncertainty. Only one who has experienced the collapse of the ideological structure he had fashioned for himself can look upon the structure of others with a tolerant eye and locate within them the kernels of truth. So Rabbi Eldar is now trying to expound upon this quote from the Talmud about how sages would not depart from a table of argumentation until they loved one another, until they found some way of appreciating the other person. And Rabbi Eldar points out, the love has nothing to do with answering the specific question that they were arguing over. It has to do with respecting the other person's opinion and at least causing each one to have some degree of doubt about their own position. So that's what he says love is about. When you're willing to create space within yourself and to perhaps minimize your own self-assuredness about your position, that you can absorb another person's point of view. That's what love is about, according to Rabbi Eldar. So we have a very fascinating tradition having to do with descendants of the apparent leader of this rebellion, Korach. And this is also from the Talmud. This is from Masechet Sanhedrin. And let me share with you this entire section from the Talmud. Because we're going to read in just a couple of weeks' time from chapter 26, we're going to read this verse. The sons of Korach did not die. Okay, so the Talmud says, with regard to the verse, and the sons of Korach did not die, it is taught in a Baraita, an early rabbinic teaching, that in the name of our teacher, the sages said, a place was fortified for them in Gehenna, and they sat upon it and recited songs of praise. Rabbi Bar Hana said, one time I was walking on the path, and a certain Arab said to me, come, I will show you those from the assembly of Korach who were swallowed. I went and I saw 2 fissures in the ground from which smoke was emerging. That Arab took a woolen fleece and dampened it with water and placed it on the tip of his spear and passed it over the fissures there. The fleece was singed, indicating the level of heat there. He said to me, listen, what do you hear? And I heard that this is what they were saying. Moses and his Torah are truth, and they, referring to themselves, are liars. Here's a wonderful story that appears in the Talmud, which seems to give some kind of redemptive aspect to not only followers, but the very family of Korach, who are now, in a sense, in this place of purgatory, where they are reflecting on perhaps what was the malformation of their own party's position, and that are now reconsidering the certainty with which they all rose up and challenged Moses and Aaron. So we have within Psalms, several Psalms that are in fact attributed to the sons of Korach. And this is one of them. This is from Psalm 49. Such is the fate of those who are self-confident, the end of those pleased with their own talk. Sheep-like they head for Sheol, with death as their shepherd. Fascinating that within Psalms, we have several that are attributed to these sons of Korach, which again, like our bit of Midrash from the Talmud, is an indication of their reflection upon the position that they and their family and their followers had taken in their challenge to Moses, and they are now willing to reconsider what their position had been. So oftentimes when we're talking about Korach, the word demagogue is often referred to, is used in referring to Korach. There's a very fascinating article that was written by a woman named Trish Roberts Miller, who is an emeritus professor of rhetoric and writing at the University of Texas in Austin. And she wrote an article called Media, Rhetoric, and the Demagoguery of the Elite. And in that article, she wrote, demagoguery isn't something a cunning individual does to the ignorant masses. It is a way people think about their options. So here's the question I came up with after reading that, which is, how do we open up people's options? How do we help mitigate the fears, the reasonable fears that people have in the face of changing conditions? How do we help them, if you will, transpose those fears into new ways of thinking, into ways of contributing to the society as a whole, rather than separating themselves off and engaging in some kind of conflict with the rest of society? So for that, I'd like us to turn back, if you have the study sheet, and look at this painting. This is a painting by Berthe Morisot, one of the great Impressionist painters. And it's called In England. It's she was French, and she and her husband go on a bit of a vacation. They go to England, and this painting is called In England. And we're going to look closely at this painting to see what it's telling us about the nature of perhaps different points of view. In the painting, we have this figure in the foreground, and that's her husband, Eugene Manet. And it's maybe hard to tell, but in his right hand, he has a pair of binoculars, which indicates that at some point he was looking through the binoculars out the window and out towards what is the sea on the other side of the window. And now he's dropped the binoculars, and instead of his gaze being through the binoculars and out into the long distance, his gaze has now shifted. His gaze is now looking at this woman who's in the right-hand side of the painting. And the woman herself is now gazing, and her gaze is directed at a young girl who's in the middle of the painting. And the young girl herself is now gazing. She's gazing probably at the many different boats that are there in the harbor. So we have several different points of view, several different perspectives, several different gazes that are going on. Eugene Manet, we have the woman who is probably the chaperone of this young girl. And then we have a third, we have the girl and what she's looking at. And then of course we have another gaze, and that's the gaze of the painter herself. And she is now taking all of this in, and she seems to be fascinated with the different directions in which these people are looking. And she has crafted all that with a window being the centerpiece of this painting. And if you notice the frame of the window and then the gate outside create these parallel lines that kind of create this little bit of a slit through which we can view the centerpiece of this painting. So in a sense, this painting is a reflection on the many different perceptions that can be going on at any single moment in time. This was painted, as I think, by Berthe Morisot, who was a woman, and which in and of itself was quite extraordinary, because up until the time of the Impressionists, it was virtually impossible for a woman to gain access to the world of art and painting, because the academies were, had a monopoly on people who could become successful artists, did not allow women in them. And it was very rare for a woman to be able to get a painting shown at an exhibition, because the whole system within France wrapped around these different academies that taught painting, and then the academies were the ones that selected who would be able to exhibit. So women were largely excluded from becoming significant and well-regarded and successful artists. The Impressionists changed all that. The Impressionists abandoned the whole notion of having to go through the academies and having to go through the formal authority structure that decided who was allowed to exhibit paintings, the Impressionists created their own exhibitions beginning in 1874. And Berthe Morisot was one of those who was in the very first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. The Impressionists were criticized in the early decades of their existence for a number of reasons. They were criticized for their technique, for the use of broad brush strokes as opposed to fine brush strokes. They were criticized for revealing the evident hand of the artist, whereas in classical art, the artist's unique hand was not supposed to be evident. But they were also criticized for their choice of subject matter. The dominant paradigm in the art world at the time was that the subject matters of art should be either matters of history, mythology, or some biblical lesson, something that would teach something that was heroic, something that would teach a grand value, something that would teach an enduring and absolute truth about the world. And instead, the Impressionists completely shifted what their focus of their art was. They looked at everyday life. They looked at the domestic aspects of life. And for this, interestingly enough, the Impressionists were criticized for being too feminine. So what the Impressionists did was they began both with the choice of subject matter and with how they presented their subject matter. They began to open up different planes and perspectives. They began a blurring of that which was supposed to be clear and definite. And this was the beginning of modern art. This led to the post-impressionists such as Cézanne. This led to the development of Cubism and all of modern art. It was a rejection of the notion that there is but a single truth, which only a great artist could convey, and that was the obligation of a great artist. Instead, the Impressionists broke open. They created a rupture, if you will, in art history by saying there are many points of view. There are many different perspectives, and these are all worthwhile to present. So I'd like to suggest that what the Impressionists did was what we would call, what actually Aviva Zornberg calls a vital rupture, a rupture that engenders a new way of looking at the world, a way that opens up the world to allow more perspectives to come into the world so that we might encounter them and thereby learn something about other people and cause ourselves to rethink our own sense of perspective. So with that, I'd like to open it up to everyone's perspectives to share what you thought about this week's Torah portion. Let me begin. Anyone around the table here have any comments?
Well, I had a thought about this picture.
Just a little bit louder,
I had a thought about the picture and about the different points of view.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about Chekhov's The Three Sisters. And, they're all talking at each other and there's no real communication between the sisters talking here. And if they're not hearing each other, they're passing each other up. And it's not that there's argument. It's just that there's no touchstone. There's nothing there between the relationships.
Oh, that's lovely, Shara. Thank you so much for introducing Chekhov and the Three Sisters. That's lovely. Thank you.
Well,
Richard, did you?
I hope one thing, but I'll just give you two.
A little louder.
One is the plating of the fire pans, that they've been used improperly, but they're sacred because they were used. And so they're set up there as kind of a hedge and to remind you. But they're bright, and you're getting your mirror image. And it's humbling to see your mirror image. And of course, we have two sides in our brain, and they're always in conversation. And we learn to talk so that if we want other people to hear our report, we have to listen to their report. And lastly, well, two little things. In moral development research, if you take somebody at a lower level and try to argue them up a little bit, it drives them back. And I'm thinking now of,
Say that again, will you?
if there are stages, in developmental stages in the development of moral judgment, and they go through a sequence of cognitive formation about what's ethical, it takes time and abstract reasoning. And if we work with young children and adolescents as they go through that, and you try and coach them into getting up to the next level, it drives them backwards. And lastly, my notion is about Korah is, and you're saying this cleaving, breaking apart so that you can reintegrate, that seems to me in Korah, what's going on in Israel now. Exactly what's going on in Israel now. We have many parties joined together to govern, an Arab party, a right party, a left party that's going to change. And this is going to either go up in smoke, or it's going to find a new way to listen and deal with how you put together the secular and the religious to form a democracy.
Very interesting.
And Democrats and Republicans are both right, except when they drive each other to their extremes. And then they can't share what's on the two sides of the object they're looking at. We need the whole view. And so it busts into a parliament or falls apart or gets to an autocracy. And in here, lastly, in here, the business of the the Levites, they get a lot of goodies. They get a lot of stuff. But what they don't have is land. So it's really hard for them to become capitalists.
Okay.
They can't become. So that's what I got out of today's post.
Thank you. Oh, Daniel, did you have something you'd like to say?
Yeah, also about that in relation to the times. As a child of the 90s, coming up at the height of postmodernism, it's been very dismaying in the last quickly 10 years or so, in the 21st century, this movement farther and farther away from the type of thinking you're talking about, that there are more than one correct perspective and you need all of them, and this emphasis on dialogue and sharing and other stuff, and that it's okay to have conflict, it's okay to have nuance and mystery. It seems like it's been moving, and I think a lot of it's driven by the online technology towards this like cancel culture mentality, where it's just trying to get back to this one truth, one thinking, the same type of thinking that Korach was criticized for, just having a very narrow definition, having everything nice and neat and tidy, no ambiguity, no complexity, no nuance.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll scoot up.
Anna,
So you
yes.
can see. Speaking of complexity and nuance, I discovered one time, when by actually good fortune, but you might not think of it that way, I didn't have any money to buy food, which was all right in the summer because I had goats and chickens and garden and green things. But when winter came, the plants kind of went away in the Northwest, and the goats aren't producing milk and the chickens are laying way fewer eggs. I could live off beans and grains because you can sprout them, or you can cook them. I ran out of oil and butter, and that wasn't quite so pleasant. But when I ran out of salt, nothing tasted right at all. So what did he just say? Nuance, right? We need to have nuance. And I think it's really interesting that in this Torah portion, one of two places in the Bible it mentions salt. And that after all this covenant of salt, and after so many things were taken away, I mean, actually people swallowed up in the earth, taken away, that there's this little blessing, this covenant of salt. And in my very old King James Version Bible, when I looked up the second reference, which is in Ezekiel, No. Second Chronicles 13, verse 5. It says, ought you not to know that the Lord God of Israel gave the kingdom over Israel to David forever, even to him and to his sons as a covenant by salt. And then the footnote on that is covenant of friendship.
Oh, salt and
That's where I
friendship.
was going.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
Thank you, Anna.
That's
All
great. Yeah.
Let me, I'm going to invite some people who are here. Susan?
So what you said about Aaron and Miriam being related to Moses and Korach being related to Moses, and therefore all of Korach's tribe being related to Moses. And I guess it made me think about things in terms of all the different voices that we have inside of us talking about how we should do things and why we should do things, and the constant ongoing controversy within ourselves. And then it's up to us to try and listen to the right voices, I guess. And that brought me to one other place, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I just heard this week that the reason that we listen more to the voice of Hillel is that Hillel always included the words of Shammai.
Yep.
Not only did they include the words of Shammai, but they had Shammai's words first. They articulated their position first. Yeah, as a way of honoring them. Okay.
And then the other thing was that the artwork made me look up when you said that his name was Eugene Manet, and I went, Eugene Manet? Well, we know the name Manet. So I looked up Eugene Manet, and he also was an artist, just like his brother and his wife, but he wasn't as good an artist as his wife. And so he kind of dedicated his life to supporting her.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you for bringing back that. Thank you, Susan. Let me ask Paul, and then I'll get to Cheryl. Paul? Yeah.
Korach gives, I'm always interested in what God thinks, because sometimes, in a way, you have a chance here. God decides he's going to knock off this whole group of 250. And so he already knows in advance that there's going to be a big hole, and it's going to be really an impressive event that could be told. I mean, not only are the individuals, but their whole households are going to go into this big crevice. But it turns out that there's a lot being said before that God decides it's not enough to just do that. There's something in that household he's going to save for afterwards. And so he decides on the pans, the copper pans. And so in a way, you're supposed to have this grandiose thinker and he should be impressed with this business of this giant hole opening up. But then we get into this minutia of the frying pan. And so it kind of catches me. It's not just not to be trivial, but there's a lot of sentences in there. There's about four. I mean, even after this all over with, he says that those pans have to be flattened out and they have to be put in a very prominent position. So with all this emphasis before the big event and then after the big event of the pans, you guys are always thinking about the heavy stuff. So there's very little left for me to think about the lightweight stuff. And so I focus on why this focus wasn't enough, that big hole and all the people and the belongings going in there. And was that, why belittle that?
Okay, thank you, Paul. And let me call on Cheryl, then I'll get to Ruth.
If we're talking about God's view and God participating in this loving the other or understanding the other, and then we look at the story, you have to wonder whether God really understood what Korach wanted, or whether he did, and this was his decision or her decision. And I think that question is one that I'm thinking about. And I just wanted to comment on the painting. There's another viewpoint, and that's our looking at it.
Right.
Yes, and that's a rich point of view out of which new things arise. Thank you. So let me call on Ruth. Go ahead, Ruth.
Okay, hi. To go back to the minutia, I was struck by the fact that we've heard the story with the incense pans before. We just a few weeks ago, is it Ahab and was it, I can't pronounce the name. The two young sons of
Nadav
Aaron,
and Abihu.
those guys. It's like we're doing redo, deja vu again. And somebody who's not authorized is coming forth with the pans, and it doesn't go well. It ends badly. And if you just looked at the story itself and as we read, you think, well, God isn't very open to being challenged in any way, like either by people he wants some people to follow the prescribed way, and this God doesn't tolerate
mutterings.
It's easy to criticize Korach, but you could say, well, at least he wants everybody participating. He doesn't want to have just only the elite participating. And one could make an argument for that. But God doesn't want to hear that argument. That's just what struck me. And I was also looking at the detail instead of the big picture. But I'm curious to what anybody thinks about that.
Thank you, Ruth. Anyone else hasn't had a chance to? Mark Thompson, and then Gary.
A couple things. First, as just a response to one of Richard's comments about the Levites and Aaron not having any share of the territory. Maybe there's a reason for that there's a distinction between the profound and the profane, and that perhaps those of us who are spiritually inclined shouldn't be messing around with property. I don't know. It's just a possibility that there's a reason for the distinction. Second thing is, I love that painting, and I love the painting because to me, it said that we can't help but have different points of view. What is the thing that we have in common? What we have in common, to me, that the painting showed, is that these people were in this particular place at this particular time. This is what they had in common. So I think it's an elusive thing for us to think that we can ever be in a situation where we will ever be in agreement, that we need to be in disagreement, but appreciate the fact that we are all in this together at a particular point in time. And I'm thinking, you can just look back at what happened when COVID broke out. We were all in this position at this particular point of time. It happened during 9/11. I'm thinking back to the Kennedy assassination, when we all were experiencing these really traumatic events, and yet we were experiencing them together. And I think these are the times that we have the sense of commonality, which is very elusive.
Thank you, Mark. And let me ask, Gary, go ahead.
Well, I don't remember the context, Rabbi. During the study sheet, you had made a comment about if we see someone in pain or struggling, if we can reach out and help them, then we should. And I wanted to share something that I was in that place at one time, and someone gave me advice that I want to share that is going to come out and sound rather simple, but it's not easy. And I'll just throw it out there. I was scared to move forward, and a very good friend said, "Be scared, embrace it. That's okay, and just step forward." And I know that it sounds simple, but I realize that a lot of times I feel like I've got to overcome this fear before I can move forward. And I was taught that a lot of times you won't overcome it. Just step forward. So I just wanted to throw it out there.
I think that's actually very profound, Gary.
Beautiful.
Very beautifully said. Thank you so much. Let me ask first of all, anyone who hasn't had a chance to have a comment. Margot.
curious, the chapters it's called Korach. Korach. Are there any other chapters in the Tanakh that start with the name of the bad guy?
Well, it depends upon what you mean by a bad guy. Because we're going to be reading pretty soon
Yeah,
a Torah portion called Pinchas.
okay.
So it depends upon whether or not you think Pinchas was what you would call a good guy or a bad guy, or maybe human beings.
I'll wait till
Maybe
we
it's
get
possible
to
for human
Pinchas.
beings to contain both bad and good.
Well, I
And
don't see that Korach had any good. But let me tell all of you an amusing story. You mentioned Kennedy's assassination, which was a tragedy, of course. At the time, we lived in New London, Connecticut, and I was going to catch the train to New York City. The stop before New London, Connecticut was Boston. It was Boston, down the coast. By the time I got on in New London, he would have been pronounced dead. But of course, the people who had gotten on the train at Boston didn't know any of this. And I whispered to the woman sitting next to me, "Our president has been assassinated." She gave me a very strange look and moved away. And moved away from me. She thought I was a kook. Until we got to New Haven. In New Haven, they had newsboys that would go in front of the train holding up headlines, Kennedy assassinated, that sort of thing. But I said, "Our president is dead." She thought I was crazy.
it was a tragic moment that many of us here may well remember. So let me wrap this all up together, if I may, by suggesting that when Torah is describing a vista that's not outside of ourselves, it's inside of ourselves. And so what Korach is representing, if you will, is a recognition, or at least an expression that something is not working for him and for others around him. The question is, how does one articulate that? And do you articulate it in a way that creates further divisions and fissures within the body politic, within the community? Or do you articulate them in such a way that enables an exploration of what the sources of that discontent might be, that then others can then respond to? So what our study sheet, I think, has gone through is that there are ruptures. Ruptures are a part of creation. Creation itself was a rupture. The question is whether it is a rupture that is procreative, that creates new life, or is it a rupture that just deepens the hole into which all of society will just fall down into? So to not have any ruptures is a form of death. That's what Rabbi Wachtman was indicating. To have no rupture, it allows death to gain supremacy. So the question is, how do we create ruptures in a way that promotes forward progress? And how can we be aware of the potential for ruptures to just create, if you will, a black hole that just sucks all of light into it, and all there is darkness? That's the challenge that we all face, both on a very personal and intimate levels in our relationships, and also on our more public and civic lives as well. It's my hope and prayer for all of us that we will continue to come together, immerse ourselves in this wonderful body of literature and wonderful body of relationships we call Torah, and that will enable us all and each one of us to be promoters of vital ruptures. So with that, God bless you all. Thank you so much for coming together. Look forward to being with you again. My very best to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Mhm.